review the frequently asked questions and answers pertaining to the prior 5 webinars on the revised NORS. And Katie, yes, go ahead and hit record. Thank you. Attendees include State Ombudsman and representatives of the Office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, representatives of the office, often called local or regional ombudsman, and states are our target audience today. Our speakers today are Louise Ryan, Ombudsman Program Specialist with the Administration on Aging, Administration for Community Living, Maria Green, NORC Consultant, and myself, Amity Overall-Labe, and I'm with NORC. You are muted today, so if you have any questions, please submit those in that Q&A box. If you move your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, the little bar will pop up and it says Q&A. So click on that and that's where you enter your questions. And if you also look in the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen, it should pop up again if you move your mouse down at the bottom of your screen. There are links for where the PowerPoint slides are. So we we'll respond to those questions as much as we can towards the end of the webinar. Next slide, please, Katie. So today's agenda includes remarks from ACL, an overview of edits to the NORS training materials, a review of our new resources, and a discussion of the FAQs developed in response to questions we received from you all from the revised NORS training webinar series. We will have time for questions, and then at the very end, we'll provide some reminders of available resources, as well as let you know of additional training and support that will be available from NORC and ACL. But for today's webinar, we're really focusing on the FAQs. So the questions that we answer at the end of the webinar should be related to the FAQs that we discussed today. Again, just write those in the chat box, and we'll do our best to respond to them. Next slide. And so now I'd like to welcome Louise Ryan, Ombudsman Program Specialist with the Administration for Community Living.
Thank you, Amity. And next slide, please. So there's a few things I just want to remind you all to do in terms of preparing for the new NORS data collection. First of all, just a reminder, October 1st is only 1 week away, and this is the beginning of the new federal fiscal year, and with it comes the revised National Ombudsman Reporting System, or the NORS. The bullets on this list here are just kind of reminders for you to use to prepare, kind of a checklist. And so just to kind of review those, just a reminder, there are 5 NORS webinar trainings in addition to today's frequently asked questions. And the webinars are online on the Ombudsman Resource Center website. And of course, with the webinars comes the training materials, so all the questions and then all the answers that you can then also use to provide extra training to your representatives. So there's lots of resource there. Another thing to think about for state ombudsman or state ombudsman staff is that you are hopefully by now well down the road in terms of working with your vendor or your state IT staff to provide guidance and training related to any changes that you are making to your software. So whether you've been working with an IT staff or a vendor, that you're well on your way there and that you're at the point of where you're starting to, or you already have trained those who enter data into your software systems, that they're familiar with any changes that have been made. It's also time for state ombudsmen to provide guidance on closing cases for fiscal year 2019 and to prepare for any transition if you have cases that are still open and will close in the new fiscal year, which means you have to use the new codes. How do you do that transition? And just a reminder that with this transition to the new NORS data collection, We also have new federal data collection software called OAPS, the Older Americans Act Performance System. Excuse me. And states must have their complaint data in their state software in order to upload into the OAPS. So gone are the days where a state ombudsman could type in their complaint numbers into the federal data collection system. So as you've learned, you will have to upload your complaint data into the OAPS. So it's very critical that now you work out all the kinks in your state software so that you can successfully enter a complaint and case data so that when it comes time to upload that data, you're well positioned to do that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amity.
Thanks, Louise. Katie, if you can go to the next slide, please.
Amity, I guess I wasn't quite finished. Sorry about that.
Or do you want to go back, Louise, to that slide?
Yeah, we can go back to it just real quickly. I had a little tickle in my throat there. So just again, a reminder that ACL, with assistance from many of you on this call, revised the NORS, and it is now in a table format. Table 1, which covers cases and complaint codes, values, and definitions. Table 2, which is the complaint codes and definitions. And Table 3, which is state program information, which also has activities that people out in the field will record, and also has sections that are more geared towards the state ombudsman. And we will provide additional training to state ombudsmen a little later on those parts of Part 3, the program information. And as you know, this information is available in a variety of places, and I would encourage you to go to the NORC website to, if you don't have these tables yet, to get them, print them, live with them, and really get to know these revised tables. So now I will turn it over to Amity.
Thanks, Louise. All right, so just so you know, I wanted to highlight the fact that we made some edits to the NORS training materials, and these edits were made based on feedback we received from you all during the training webinars earlier this year. We closely reviewed all the questions and comments we received during each webinar in order to identify quiz questions and/or answers that may need to be revised. And we really appreciate the input that state ombudsmen and representatives provided as we realized these changes needed to be made. So please use the edited versions that are available on the website. We realize many of you have already trained on the original versions, especially if you participated in the webinar series. So we apologize for having to look back and make any changes in your training, but we felt it was more important to make sure that we had the best question and answers in order to help with reporting consistency and to respond to your feedback. You'll know if you're using the most current version if they say revised in September, as you can see in that red circle in the example on your screen. The training PowerPoints have been edited too to reflect these changes, so you should be able to just download the entire package with the basic principles, the quiz answer sheet, and the PowerPoints in order to use them for training. Just so you know, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, no other edits will be made until the ACL tables expire, which is in 2021. However, we are keeping an internal list of any suggestions for changes to either these training materials or even the ACL tables. So if you have any, let us know. Our emails are at the end of this PowerPoint slide, or you could contact us at the Ombudsman Center website, the general email. So I want to review the edits really quickly. Again, there are 6. The first one is part of the Part 2 quiz answer sheet, question number 4, section D. We changed the answer to D09, other rights and preferences. Originally, it was D01, choice in healthcare. This was the situation where the resident continued to tell the staff that he didn't want to take a shower, but the staff required that he took a shower at least once a week. Based on your feedback, we did feel that it was a better fit for D09 because the facility was not honoring the resident's choice not to take a shower, instead of saying that the resident's treatment schedule wasn't being accommodated or his right to choose a healthcare provider was denied. Part 3, quiz and quiz answer sheet, question 2 was edited. That answer changed from D09 to H02, dining and hydration, because the original complaint from the family member was that staff were not assisting his mom to the dining room. The complaint was not that her rights and preferences weren't honored. Again, on Part 3, question 13, this was the scenario about the bad smell in the residential care community that the Ombudsman noticed. There were a lot of questions about why it was considered not verified, since the smell was confirmed by the Ombudsman and the residents. However, the cause of that smell was not what was originally thought by the residents. Verification is defined as a confirmation that most or all facts alleged by the complainant are likely to be true. So we certainly understood the points made by you all, and we edited the scenario and the answer a little bit to be clearer about why not verified is the correct answer. Part 4, quiz and quiz answer sheet, questions 9 and 10, these were about coding visits as complaint related or not complaint related, and we edited them to make sure it was consistent with the FAQ that we'll discuss later in the presentation about visits. And then the last one was Part 4 as well, question number 13. This was the scenario that talked about an ombudsman stopping at a facility to drop off posters and brochures, and then another ombudsman coming back that same day for a resident council meeting. The scenario originally said that it counted as 2 visits, and it still does, but there were several questions about whether just dropping off posters and brochures counted as a visit. The original scenario said the first ombudsman was invited to the resident council meeting, therefore assuming that a resident invited her, meaning she spoke with at least one resident, but it wasn't that clear in the scenario. So we clarified that to make sure that the scenario as well as the answer were a bit clearer. So again, thank you for your feedback on those. Next slide, please. So, excuse me. So like Louise mentioned earlier, we really encourage you to get really familiar with those ACL tables 1, 2, and 3. However, we did create some new, we're calling them, for lack of a better word, complaint codes cheat sheets. Many of you requested complaint code cheat sheets with only the codes and the labels, so we created one. It's only 1 page, and it's the screenshot on the left-hand side of this slide. We also created a complaint codes cheat sheet with the codes, labels, definitions, examples, and reporting tips. This format is actually based on an example shared by Jennifer Williams-Woods, the State Ombudsman in Nevada, so thank you, Jennifer. The content in this resource on the right-hand side of your screen includes the same information from Table 2. Complaint codes and definitions, it's just in a format that's similar to the current NORS complaint codes document. So it may be easier for folks to read instead of looking at the tables. However, we still want you to use those tables. But those are available and the URLs are on that slide. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, today we're going to cover the top frequently asked questions and answers. These FAQs are based on your questions, and thanks again for sharing those. Next slide. We had over 125 questions, of which some of them were duplicative or at least discussed similar concerns. The answers, the questions and the answers were developed with input from members of the work group to improve NORS consistency, otherwise known as WINC, and in coordination with the Administration for Community Living, ACL. The WINC members include 7 state ombudsmen, 1 state staff person, and 2 local ombudsmen. And those local ombudsmen gathered input on these FAQs from the NALCO board, which is the National Association of Local Long-Term Care Ombudsmen. So thank you for that. These answers are considered final answers. We remind you that these are common examples and that circumstances may vary a little bit in the field. We suggest that if you have difficulty coding a case or complaint, that you review the materials and really just use your best judgment. Most important, bottom line for everything is that you document all that you do. These 20 questions are the first phase of the FAQs for the revised NORS. We are sure that we're going to end up publishing more FAQs as we identify areas that need more clarification after implementation on October 1st. So if you have suggestions for future FAQs, please email them to ombudscenter@theconsumervoice.org. The FAQs are organized in alphabetical order on the website, and we also have them available in a PDF, so you can download it for your reference while documenting your work or providing and participating in training. So those categories are abuse, neglect, and exploitation, complainant, complaint coding, disposition, information and assistance, opening and closing a case, referral, survey participation, verification, and visits. The answers for some of the FAQs are abbreviated on the slides for today's presentation just for the sake of time. In the NORS training materials, just as a reminder, ombudsman is used as a generic term that may mean state ombudsman, a representative of the office, or the ombudsman program as a whole. And sometimes we occasionally use LTCO to stand for ombudsman in these slides to simply shorten the text. We will take questions at the end of the presentation, and so now I'm going to turn this over to Maria so she can start reviewing the FAQs.
Hi, hello everyone. We'll go to the next slide. As Amity mentioned, we're going in alphabetical order, so the first grouping is under abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Next slide. So the question was, does the Ombudsman Program investigate complaints alleging abuse, neglect, or exploitation? And the answer is yes. The Ombudsman Program investigates complaints or concerns that include abuse, neglect, or exploitation. So in the detailed FAQs, if you're looking at your document, we always list the source from the Code of Federal Regulations. We provide information from the statute if appropriate, so that you can look back there for more detailed answers. But to reiterate, the Ombudsman Program investigates abuse, neglect, or exploitation in accordance with the program policies and procedures, which addresses obtaining consent to take the action, consent to disclose, and actions to take when a resident is unable to communicate informed consent. So on the next slide, we have a little bit more an abbreviated answer. So the Ombudsman's investigation is solely for gathering the necessary information to resolve the complaint to the satisfaction of the resident, and it's not to determine whether any law or regulation has been violated for purposes of a potential civil or criminal enforcement action. You should use your best judgment in coding a complaint based on the knowledge obtained from the complainant or resident in their fact finding. So for example, if you're not sure if this is one where, or it's difficult to distinguish if it's a rough handling by staff or it's a willful mistreatment of a resident, which would be coded as A1 physical abuse, or a staffing issue, which could be JO3 staffing, or it could be more than one complaint. We're asking in this scenario that you think this through and use your best determination, your best judgment about how to code it based on what you're hearing from the complainant. Next slide. This one is also about abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And the question is, why is there a perpetrator code for abuse, neglect, or exploitation complaint? This was added to NORS to assist the Administration for Community Living and Ombudsman programs in understanding who is most commonly suspected of causing the abuse, neglect, or exploitation. in the long-term care facility, and to help, frankly, better analyze our data. Just a reminder that the perpetrator codes are only used for abuse, gross neglect, and exploitation complaints that are A01 through A05. Another question came up about whether or not, why didn't we use the word alleged? In the definition in the NORS table, it does say the person who appears to have caused the abuse or neglect. So I just wanted to make that point. Now we can go to the next slide. The category is opening and closing cases. So the first question is, when do you open a case? Well, the answer is open it as soon as possible after the complainant communicates the complaint and asks for ombudsman assistance to resolve that complaint. The NORS data collection requires that you have a case open and a case closed date, but does not specify policies and procedures for the timeline. So you see that little asterisk down there at the bottom of the slide, which references the fact that your state long-term care ombudsman program may have a policy and procedures which specify timeframes for when a case should be opened, how soon it should be opened, and documented in the electronic reporting system that your state has. Okay, the next slide addresses, when do you close a case? So you close the case when the investigation is complete. And you see that little asterisk down there at the bottom again that references your state ombudsman program's policy. So if you're listening and you're not sure what the policy is for your state, I would direct that question to your state ombudsman or someone there in the office of the state long-term care ombudsman program, if there are specifics in your state about the expectation for when to document the information, especially in particular to opening or closing the case. Next slide. So the question is, do you have the resident's permission to investigate a complaint and started to investigate, and then the resident changed their mind, doesn't want you to continue the investigation and do any of the resolution activities? So is this still a case? The answer is yes, it is still a case. In the scenario, the resident had requested your assistance, but then they changed their mind and they asked you to stop doing the investigation work. So it's still a case with a complaint that disposition code of 02, which is withdrawn or no action needed by the resident representative, or the complainant. I want to also point out, as this has been asked by others, is there a certain amount of time spent on a case or complaint? Does that affect whether or not it is a case or a complaint? And the answer is no. I mean, you could have a case that you open and close on the same day, or you could have one that takes you 30 days to do the work to the satisfaction of the resident in that their direction or the complainant. The important thing, again, as Amity and Louise love to say, and we all say, document your activity and your work. So the next question, is it still about opening and closing a case? The program receives a complaint from someone other than the resident, and upon an initial investigation, the ombudsman speaks to the resident who does not agree with the complaints and does not want assistance from the program. Is this the case? Next slide. Drum roll. Yes, it's a case. The complainant identified a problem that affects the health, safety, welfare, or rights of one or more of the residents, and requested the ombudsman program to take action to resolve the identified problem. However, the ombudsman program is to determine the perspective of the resident and take direction from the resident. In this scenario, the resident did not share the same concerns as the person who called in the complaint, so then the case is closed. Even though it was withdrawn, it helps to build a picture of possible issues happening at that facility. Also, it's important to consider the first person that contacted the program with a complaint as the complainant, because the Administration for Community Living wants to analyze the complaints and their dispositions based on that report of the initial complaint. If the resident is unable to communicate and provide guidance to the Ombudsman should investigate based on the complaint received and follow the program's complaint investigation protocols. Next slide. When a nursing facility sends the Ombudsman program copies of the resident's discharge notices, should the program open a case at the time of receipt of the notice? Next slide. Okay, we got a lot of feedback on this, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about it. So the answer is no, you're not going to open a case, because then immediately when you receive the notice, the nursing facility is not asking the Ombudsman program to establish a case and investigate. Therefore, at the point of receipt of the notice, there is no complainant for which to establish a case. The nursing facilities are meeting a federal requirement by sending copies of the notices to the Ombudsman program. In this situation, the Ombudsman program is not yet actively involved in investigating and working to resolve the discharges, and no one has asked them to on behalf of a resident. Rather, the nursing facilities, they're just sending out these notices as part of their routine compliance with one of their requirements. But let's talk about this a little bit more. We're going to go to the next slide. And let's talk about these. So if you follow up with a resident, let's say you receive the notice, you go out and you make a visit with a resident who receives the notice, or if their family member or friend contacted you for assistance, you may have a case then, or it may very well turn out it becomes an information and assistance. If you empower the resident to take action, you feel that they can handle it themselves, or if you have a family member who says yes, they can help file the appeal or take the next steps, then that may eventually be recorded as an information and assistance if they're not asking you to do anything further to help them other than provide that information. With the second bullet, if the resident or their representative asks you for information or suggestions on how to proceed with the discharge or with an appeal, that could be recorded definitely as an information and assistance. If the resident or their representative asks you to investigate, identify options, or help them stay in the facility or find another solution, then it would be recorded as a case. When you refer back to the documents, once again, we mentioned that it's in the chat window there with the link to the actual FAQ. You'll see references to CMS guidelines where I mentioned that it's a facility requirement to send it to the Ombudsman program, and there's a little bit more in-depth information there. Next slide, the category, it's about the complainant. So the first question, when there are multiple people involved with one complaint, how do we choose the complainant? For example, a daughter calls the Ombudsman program with a complaint, and the Ombudsman visits with the resident, and the resident shares her daughter's concerns and gives the Ombudsman permission to investigate the complaint. So in this one, because the first person who notified you of the complaint was the daughter, then they would be the complainant, and it would be coded as representative, friend, or family. Also in the notes on our document, we give you guidance or suggest questions that you can look back to at the quiz, and you can see applicable scenarios where we also give the answer about how to code. Okay, the next one, when should the Ombudsman program be the complainant? The Ombudsman program may be the complainant in a variety of circumstances, but the most common examples include when you're there and you see general observations about the facility environment that need attention, and these may include circumstances where the residents agree with the problem and want it addressed, but do not want to be identified, so then the Ombudsman would be the complainant. If you're looking back at your quiz, you want to see which ones deal with, which scenario quiz and answers deal with this. It's number 8 in particular on part 1 of our training. The next slide gets a little bit more of an in-depth answer. It is typical for the Ombudsman to educate a resident about their rights and share any observations about the individual's residence, health, safety, or welfare. So this discussion may result in a resident requesting your assistance to resolve the complaint. In this example, the process of educating the resident and encouraging the resident to request assistance on their behalf, you would then therefore document as the resident being the complainant. Okay, I think we're ready to go to the next section, which is complaint coding. And as Katie's moving it forward to complaint coding, the first one under complaint coding, I believe my screen has frozen, so I'm going to go.
I'm sorry, Maria, we can see it, so if you just move forward, I think we're good. It's the first one. Okay, I think we may have lost Maria's audio, so I'm going to take over until she can join again. So complaint coding, the question was, when do you assign complaint codes? For example, if a family member contacts your office with a concern and requests action, do you code it after you've spoken with the resident to try to get consent to investigate the issue? And the answer is, assign the complaint code upon receipt of the complaint based on the problem or problems identified by the complainant. So assign those complaint codes as soon as you receive that information. However, just for additional information, if a family member contacts you, the family member is the complainant, and you assign those complaint codes immediately based on the concerns shared by that family member. When you go and visit the resident for consent to take further action, if the resident agrees with those concerns and gives you consent and then shares additional concerns, then you can open another case with the resident as the complainant and include complaint codes for the resident's additional concerns. However, if the resident does not agree with the family member and asks you not to proceed, you would close the case as withdrawn or no action needed. The program still had a complaint and it might be legitimate, but in order to honor the resident's direction, you do not move forward with that issue. All right, next slide, Katie. Thank you. We received this question from a few different folks. When a complainant has two complaints or issues that would fall under the same code, do I only record the code once? Yes, record one complaint and work to resolve all the issues raised under that complaint. So for example, if a complainant has two complaints that are under one code, such as code I-05, housekeeping, laundry, and pest abatement, the Ombudsman will open that with one complaint code and then work on all those issues under that code. Next slide. If there is a case where the complaint could be documented under two different codes, do I just choose one? Yes, choose one code. Use your best judgment in determining which complaint code to use if there are two very similar codes that could describe the complaint. And that may happen fairly frequently, especially as you get comfortable with these new complaint codes and definitions. If there are multiple distinct complaints, identify the codes, of course, for each complaint. Next slide. When is it appropriate to add another complaint to an existing case or establish a new case? So in short, your state may have a policy with criteria for when to open and close cases and when to consider adding more complaints in the current open case. If not, use your best judgment if there's no policy. For example, if the case is open, the complainant is the same, and casework is ongoing, then it would make sense to add that new complaint to the current case. However, if the case was closed and the complainant comes to you with a new complaint, then it would make sense to open a new case at that time. Next slide. So the next group we're going to talk about is verification. Next slide. And the question is, what is the definition for verified? If the resident confirms the complaint, does that mean it's verified? And per the actual NORS table, the definition of verified is a confirmation that most or all facts alleged by the complainant are likely to be true. You can review the NORS training, specifically the Part 3, complaint verification, coding, disposition, referrals, and closing a complaint and a case for additional information about verification. Next slide. And it's important when you're determining whether to verify a complaint, you need to consider the following. Obviously, interview the complainant or the resident, your observations, and assuming that you have consent to disclose, facts can be gathered from interviews of staff and others that may be involved in order to check, do some fact checking. And then, of course, you may need to review records or other documents as well. And then for additional training, if you would like to refer back to Module 4, the problem-solving process of the NORT curriculum, there's a lot of guidance in there that would help. It applies to verification in that entire process. Next slide.
Amity?
Yes.
Hi, it's Maria. Would you like for me to pick up, starting with referral?
Sure, that sounds good.
Okay, thank you for covering for me.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question on the referral is, how do I code referrals to the Office of Inspector General, Attorney General, and State Attorney or professional boards, such as the Board of Nursing? The answer is to use the referral code 03, law enforcement or prosecutor, for the Office of Inspector General, or Attorney General, and State Attorney. And then you may use referral code 01, licensing, regulatory, or certification agency, for the professional boards of licensing. And just as a reminder, there were quite a few options. 01 was, as I just mentioned, licensing, regulatory certification agency. 02 is adult protective services. 03 is law enforcement or prosecutor. 04 is protection and advocacy. I just want to mention that that may be known as a different name in your state, but that's the agency who usually provides advocacy services for people with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities. Code 05 is for legal services. 06 is no referral was made. And then 99 is other. So we'll go to the next category, which is disposition. And the first question, how do I determine the disposition code if the resident dies during the investigation? So there's an Ombudsman Program regulation, you see the number there, that provides guidance on how to determine the complaint disposition in the following order. It's communication from the resident first, the resident's representative, and the Ombudsman Program. So on the next slide, you'll see some examples. So if the complainant is the resident and the resident died before all the complaints were resolved, the Ombudsman would need to determine the disposition based on the circumstances of the complaint or information from a resident representative. The other example is you can turn to the family member. If the Ombudsman visits the resident and the resident is unable to communicate, more than likely you will be working with that family member to help resolve the issues. And if the resident dies, you're obviously going to turn back to that family member and speak with them about whether or not the completion of the work, your investigation task, and then as to their satisfaction with the resolution of your work. The next category are frequently asked questions regarding program activities. In the first category is information and assistance. And the question is, a resident asks an ombudsman for help and provides consent to investigate. After the ombudsman shares information about the resident's rights and the facility's responsibilities, she decides to use the information you provided to address her concerns on her own and doesn't want the ombudsman assistance. Is this a case or information and assistance? The answer is on the next slide. It is an instance of information and assistance. In this scenario, the resident asked for help, and you were able to provide information without actually beginning the investigation. The next category is survey participation. So how do I count participation in facility surveys? You may report each distinct type of survey activity as one instance by facility type. You may have more than one survey participation activity associated with one survey in one facility. Survey participation includes, but is not limited to, pre-survey information to surveyors, sharing complaint summary reports, participation in exit conferences, and informal dispute resolution. Next slide. Does reading a survey count as participation in a facility survey? No, it does not. NORS does not ask that you report all activities, and reading a survey, while important, is not reported in NORS. However, just as a reminder, your state data system and policy may require that you collect additional activities not reported in NORS. So our next category is visits. If I visit a facility in response to a complaint, but I also visit with other residents and then share information about the Ombudsman program, do I document this as a visit, as a complaint visit, or a routine access visit? In parentheses, non-complaint visit. On the next slide, to determine the answer for that, whether to report your visit as a complaint visit or a routine access visit, focus on the activities that you conducted during the visit, rather than necessarily the initial reason for the visit and any program requirements. Although the original reason in this scenario was for visiting the facility was to follow up on a complaint, if you also conducted activities that constitute a routine access visit, such as talking with multiple residents, sharing information about the program, walking around and observing activities in the facility, then you may document this as a routine visit. If you visited the facility in response to the complaint and you only conducted activities related to the complaint investigation, then you would document the visit as a complaint visit. Most importantly, document all your visits. The resources that you can refer back to are ACL's Table 3, where there's definition of routine visits and some examples that are there. So I'm going to turn over the webinar back over to Amity to facilitate questions and also towards the end to close out with reminders of resources.
Thanks, Maria. So we actually don't have any questions yet in the question and answer box. So just as a reminder, take your mouse, scroll to the bottom of your screen, and there's a little icon that says Q&A, so type in your question there, or you can type in a question into the chat box. So please, if you have any questions, enter those, and we'd be happy to answer them. While you're looking, I did want to mention, and I think we covered it, it was a comment that came through the chat feature, and I believe it was after we talked about complaint coding and when to assign complaint codes, and the attendee was asking about clarifying that Ombudsman should follow state policy in terms of opening another case or adding new complaints to the current case. So I just wanted to reiterate that yes, that is addressed under the opening and closing a case section of the FAQs, and it's kind of addressed in two questions, both the one about when do you add new complaints as well as when do you assign complaint codes. So just wanted to highlight that while maybe you are mulling over questions. And if you don't have any questions now and you think of some as soon as we hang up, or you take some time to look at the FAQs again and really mull over them, then you certainly can send in any questions you have to us, either directly to our personal emails that are at the end of this presentation or to the Ombuds Center at the consumervoice.org email address. So it looks like we got a question. In regards to surveys, if the survey team calls to inform our office they'll be going into a facility in the near future, do we count that as survey participation? So let me look at that. Just one second. Survey participation. So I think, again, the most important thing to remember about survey participation, sorry about that, is that you can report each distinct type of survey activity as one instance by the facility type. So yes, if the survey team calls you to inform you that they'll be going into a facility, I assume when you're talking to them, they are also sharing information kind of as part of their pre-survey work. You're sharing historical information about your visits to that facility, any kind of complaints you're receiving, and so on. So that would be an instance of survey participation. And then if you go out and you visit them on site or participate in the exit, then that would be another instance. So there could be situations when you have more than one survey participation activity associated with one survey and one facility. Good question. Thank you. So should we open a case if a facility doesn't complete a discharge notice properly? That really depends. As was mentioned in the FAQ about discharge notices or about complaints, it's just because they're sending you the notice to your office doesn't mean that you automatically open that as a case, because that facility is just fulfilling their requirements to send you the notice. And when they send you that notice, it could be that the notice didn't have all the information it needed to have. So if you contact the resident and or the resident representative and they want to pursue this as a complaint, then you would open that as a complaint. Or if you, as the ombudsman, take any kind of action on it, then you would open it. But it doesn't necessarily mean, because you could receive 15 notices in a month, and maybe half of those aren't quote unquote proper notices. It really depends on what work you do on that notice. It doesn't mean just receiving the notice. And yes, you will have access to the webinar recording. The webinar recording will be posted on the website shortly after the webinar. And yes, thank you for your comment about the disposition code for withdrawn. We have heard from several people about the phrasing of withdrawn or no action needed. It does mean withdrawn or no action needed by the ombudsman, not by no action needed by the resident. So that is on our kind of internal list of things that we want to look at in the future for changing after 2021. So thank you for bringing that up. Okay, when you were talking about the visits FAQ, were you saying that you could potentially count one visit as both a complaint visit and a routine visit if you conduct activities that would fit both? That's a great question, and no. You can only count a visit as one thing or the other. However, if you're out on a visit and you conduct what's considered routine visit activities, like Maria said, you talk to multiple residents, you observe things in the facility, you speak with facility staff, so that would be a routine visit. And then maybe you follow up on a complaint or you receive a brand new complaint as you're walking around and talking to residents and or visitors. Then you would log that as a routine access visit. but then you would document all the other activities that took place during that visit. So you would obviously document the complaint that you either followed up on, any activity related to that, or you document the new complaint that came up during your visit. So you would still count it. You have to just count the visit as one type of visit, but you would document all the activities that you conducted during that visit. I hope that clarifies that. Okay, what if multiple ombudsman visit? For example, one ombudsman visits for complaint, another for a routine visit, and then a volunteer may visit later that day. This is actually a quiz question on some of the NORS training materials. And if those two ombudsmen, not the volunteer, because your question said the volunteer came later in that day, but assuming that the two ombudsmen that you were talking about before the volunteer visits visited together, so they were at the facility at the same time, you would only count one visit. If they were at the visit separate times, then you would count those visits as separate. So similar to that FAQ that clarified that, actually not the FAQ, I apologize, the edit to the quiz and quiz answer that I mentioned earlier, and that it counted as two visits because the ombudsman came to the same facility at separate times during that day. The first ombudsman went and did a routine access visit, talked to some residents, got an invitation to the resident council meeting, and then another ombudsman came later that day to the resident council meeting because the first ombudsman couldn't attend that meeting. So that would be two visits. So it has to be at separate times in order to count them as separate visits. So I hope that helps. Okay. Someone said, I don't have the tables, the ACL tables in front of me during the webinar. Can you remind us if there are tables defining the activities? So yes, let me go to the website. Excuse me. So just as a reminder, Table 1, and we have links to all these tables on the website, which I'll show you the screenshot and the URL soon. Table 1 is for parts A, B, and C, case and complaint codes, values, and definitions. Table 2 are the complaint codes and definitions. And Table 3 is for state program information, and that's where you'll find a lot of these activities. So good question. Okay, anything, Maria or Louise, that y'all wanted to add to my answers to any of those questions while I scroll and see if there's anything I've missed?
I think you covered it well. Just kind of reviewing the questions. And, you know, just a reminder, the tables are on the NORC website, and I strongly encourage you to print them up. Let's see, there's one other question that says, if we provide training during a resident or family council, do we document training and family resident council, or do we document one or the other? For example, providing resident rights training at a resident council. Let's see here, where did it go? I don't know if there's more to the question. Looks like that's it. You would pick one. It sounds like it's participation in resident council. Yeah, that would be resident council activity. It might be maybe that some staff were there to get some training, but you need to pick one. And if the focus was attendance at resident council or participation in, then you would count that.
Thanks, Louise. I didn't see that question until you brought that up.
A few more questions have come in, it looks like.
Yep. Okay, so if a hospital contacts the ombudsman to complain that a facility is refusing to take the resident back from the hospital, The facility issues a discharge notice while the resident's at the behavioral site and the ombudsman does not have access to the resident to see if they'd like to appeal the discharge. Should this be entered as a case? It's only entered as a case if you take action and start an investigation. So yes, if you do follow up on this contact from the hospital, then yes, it would be logged as a case and complaint if you take action on it and follow up with the resident that's at the hospital that's been dumped by that facility.
Yeah, you have to think about the parts here. You've got the complainant, which is the hospital calling to complain. The resident, you know the complaint type. You're having trouble accessing the resident, so then you need to figure out, well, how do I get, information like who's their representative? So you've got to start digging around to figure out if you can't reach the resident for some reason, how do you get in touch with a representative and, kind of start working the issues. So yeah, based on your question, it sounds like the hospital wants the assistance of the ombudsman program, related to the health, safety, welfare, and rights of a resident.
Thanks. And yes, another question, if two ombudsman volunteers go do routine visits on the same day, riding there together, oh gosh, my screen just changed. Does that count as two visits or one? So just so I understand it correctly, two volunteer ombudsmen drive together to do a routine access visit. That would count as one visit. They visited together. They, again, like I talked about earlier in the other question, they didn't do separate visits at separate times, so that would count as one visit. And NORS collects the number of facility visits, but not the number of individuals making that visit, if that makes sense. And Louise, feel free to add more if you want.
Yeah, I think that covers it, and you might want to look at, when you're visiting, to be sure to document other activities like providing information and assistance, or if one of you does a training, et cetera. And I know that seems a little complicated, but we don't want to overcount visits. We're counting, again, not the number of people who made visits, but the number of facilities that got a visit. So,
right. Thank you. So I'm not sure, I hope I'm stating this and understand this question correctly, but I'm just going to take a shot at it. So someone commented that it's great that we're collecting the views of family members or others that call in with complaints that the resident doesn't allow us to address, so the resident doesn't provide consent, so then that case or complaint is withdrawn. But it seems like it might even be more important to record the type of complaints the residents tell us that they don't allow us to address when we follow up on that. So would we record that as information and assistance in that scenario? Well, not necessarily. It depends. So I hate to keep throwing out some gray area, but so for example, if you're out on a visit and Ms. Smith shares some concerns with you and says, I really want your help with this, and you listen, and then you inform Ms. Smith of her rights and review share with her some ideas on how to resolve that issue, and then Ms. Smith says, oh, actually, I don't want your help with this now that you explained my rights and some steps I could take. I'm going to handle this on my own. I'll let you know if I can't resolve it and circle back to you. So that would not be then you wouldn't have taken action on that. So that would be an example of providing information assistance. However, if Ms. Smith says, hey, I have this concern, I want you to take action on it, you have my consent, then you do take some initial steps in starting that investigation. You're talking to staff, you're gathering some facts, and then Ms. Smith says, never mind, I don't want you to pursue this any further, I just want to drop it, then that would have been a complaint that is now withdrawn and no action needed. So it really kind of depends. You are tracking that information, but it depends on what you did, whether you took action and started a complaint, or whether you provided information assistance and how you document that work. So good, very good question, and that is addressed in the FAQs. So great question. Okay, thank you all. That's a lot of good questions. It looks like we've answered all of them. So Katie, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Thank you. So in summary, today we have heard from Louise Ryan with ACL. Thank you, Louise. We reviewed the edits that we made to the training materials and shared with you our new training materials, those NORS complaint codes cheat sheets. We reviewed the frequently asked questions and answers. We had some time for discussion. And then next, I'm going to talk about some available resources as well as additional support and technical assistance about NORS from both NORC and ACL. Next slide. Next slide. So for additional support and technical assistance, just so you know, to give you some background information, in addition to the NORS training materials and the NORS training webinars that we did, NORC staff and Maria Green, we have been providing in-depth technical assistance specifically to state ombudsmen in preparation for implementation of the revised NORS on October 1st. So this summer, we sent a questionnaire to all state ombudsmen asking about their transition process and kind of where they were and what assistance they may need or questions they had. And the most common requests for help were about the FAQ updates, additional training, assistance with their own software system issues and kind of working through those questions and seeing what other states were doing, and requests for the complaint codes cheat sheets. And as I mentioned earlier, we have tweaked the training materials in response to your input, and we'll continue to publish FAQs in the future. So again, there is our email address. Let us know if you have questions, especially after October 1st, once you start using the revised NORS. We will start hosting monthly open technical assistance calls regarding the revised NORS. Those are going to start in October and run through December. We'll provide some additional information soon, but what we envision those to be is we'll simply open a webinar line, let you know how to contact us, and we'll likely be discussing one part of the training at a time and answer questions. And so that way it's not all over the place talking about all aspects of NORS. We're going to narrow down the focus for each of those calls, but those will start in October. So I hope that you'll join us for those. We will continue to highlight NORS hot topics in the quarterly Ombudsman Outlook newsletter. So I hope that you're receiving that newsletter, and if so, continue to look for that NORS Hot Topics corner. We'll provide additional technical assistance, of course, as requested to state ombudsmen and representatives as well. We are in the process of developing a revised NORS on-demand training course, which means all of those quizzes that you have for the 4 parts of the revised NORS training, those will be in an online course. And so any new ombudsman you have, or if you want to do refresher courses with your representatives, it'll be online, and you can take the quizzes online and see the answers, and it'll be really interactive. So we are very excited about that and hope that that will be available in early to mid-2020, because we're going to do a little pilot too for that as well before it's released to everybody. And last but not least, if you are able to attend the 2019 Consumer Voice Conference coming up in November, Louise Ryan is providing a workshop regarding NORS during that conference. Next slide. So just as a reminder, this is the main landing page for NORS on the NORC website. This is the current NORS information, of course, because the revised NORS doesn't take effect until October 1st. At that point, all of the current NORS information will be archived, and the revised NORS will take over the main page. Next slide. And this is the page with all the revised NORS data collection information. As you can see, there are links to all those ACL tables that we mentioned. There's also a couple crosswalks that ACL created, including one that walks the old NORS complaint codes over to the revised NORS complaint codes, so you can see how those were merged together or collapsed, or some were just dropped off completely. It has the cheat sheets I mentioned, our training materials, and the webinar recordings. And on this page is where today's recording will be as well. Next slide. So just one final reminder that Ombudsman programs start using the revised NORS codes, definitions, and activities on October 1st. So don't start using them now, but you're almost there. And next slide. And here is our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you have. And we will do our best to respond as quickly as possible. And next slide. Just wanted to say thanks for joining today's webinar. There will be a brief survey at the end of the webinar, so once this closes out, it should pop up. So we appreciate your comments and any suggestions that you have, so please complete that. It won't take more than just a few minutes. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Maria. We really appreciate your presentations today. And of course, for more information about NORS or any assistance, please contact the Resource Center. So that is all we have for today. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.
Thank you
very
Amity.
much. Take care. Bye.